Dan Hawkins, where do you even begin? Okay, who are we kidding? You start right here.
It's a Big 12! It ain't intramurals!
The thing is, though, there's much more to a story than simply that. First and foremost, Hawkins is a winner. You do not compile a 156-92-1 record as a college football head coach by accident. Yet fans still gripe about the things he didn't do as a head coach. He could take a team of underdogs and have them punching above their weight, yet his approach was also wildly miscast at the highest levels of college football. Nepo dad, most definitely, but he was also a devoted and loving father. An offensive innovator, that's debatable. What's not debatable, though, is that he worked under or with a long list of college football's better coaches over the years. Hawkins was a character you either bought into what he was selling and fully committed to his cause, or you loathed his shtick and just found him to be a phony. He said and did dumb things, but his knowledge of football and the world at large was extraordinary as well. If you dislike him, I could totally see why. But if you respected him, I can also understand why that would be the case. In a world where we want to reduce everything down into a simple proposition, good or bad, win or loss, black or white, Hawkins cannot be reduced to one simple identifier. He just doesn't fit into any one box. He deserves a lot of credit for his accomplishments over the years and even more scorn for his failures. In a world full of cookie-cutter college football head coaches, Dan Hawkins, for better or for worse, was the exception. This is the story of college football coaching's biggest enigma.
To coin a phrase that you put out there, this ain't intramurals, brother.
If there's any one thing I can say about Dan Hawkins' football career, it's that he earned his way in this world. Nothing was given to him. That, of course, would be fairly ironic considering how he gifted his son opportunities whenever he could, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Hawkins grew up in Bieber, a podunk town lost in the abyss of northeastern California between Alturas and Redding. A place so unimaginative, the streets are named things like Sawmill Cutoff Road and Bieber Dump Road. Seriously, there were like 10 roads in the town of Bieber. Are you telling me the locals there would have been unable to find the dump unless you had the word dump in the name of the street it was located on? Anyway, the future head coach played fullback in high school, went on to play JUCO ball at College of the Siskiyous in relatively nearby Weed, California, a town name that has gotten progressively less funny the more legal marijuana has become. After 2 years of community college, Hawkins transferred to UC Davis and played 2 years for the Aggies. He was hardly a great talent, but Hawkins wasn't a slouch either. He was a component of the team's rushing attack in that 1982 season when they would advance to the Division II National Championship game. After his eligibility had expired, Hawkins, who hadn't graduated UC Davis by this point in time, moved over to the coaching staff where he would spend the next 3 seasons. Around this time, UC Davis was a hotbed of future football coaches under College Football Hall of Famer Jim Socher. Hawkins, Mike Bellotti, Gary Patterson, Paul Hackett, Chris Peterson, and Bob Biggs were all around Socher during this time. Some as players, some as coaches, and some as both. This is quite the cast of character. You have a lot of different philosophies and approaches to football in that group, but the one thing they all took away from the Davis boss was a deep respect for the game of football. After eventually earning his degree at UC Davis, Hawkins left the Toomey Field nest to spread his wings. First up was the head coaching role at Christian Brothers High School in Sacramento, California. As a 25-year-old, he led the Falcons to the unofficial Sacramento City Championship. Just don't ask about it. It's confusing. I don't want to go into it, but it was a thing. His side would lose the Sac Joaquin section title game. The following season wasn't as good, and Hawkins opted to pursue a college career, returning to the College of the Siskiyous as offensive coordinator. Oh yeah, 4 days before Hawkins announced he was leaving for that job, the school ran this ad in the Sacramento Bee. That's a bit awkward. As for Hawkins, he would go on to spend 3 seasons as the OC in Weed before being hired by Tim Walsh to be defensive coordinator at Sonoma State. He actually replaced Gary Patterson, another Davis guy. This engagement lasted for 1 season. Walsh would move on to Portland State after the year. Hawkins was looked over for the head coaching role at Sonoma State and decided he wanted to pursue a different opportunity. He found his way to Salem, Oregon, and the beautiful campus of Willamette University located across from the Oregon State Capitol. The Bearcats football program has actually existed since 1894, but it's been a fairly unremarkable existence. In fact, the team's claim to fame was playing Hawaii in Hawaii a day before the Pearl Harbor attacks. By the way, if you're interested in knowing more about that entire ordeal, well, Wrong Sports has a great video on it, and I'll put a link to that in the video description below. The season before Hawkins took over, Willamette finished 1-8. The team had not advanced to the NAIA playoffs since 1968, a year in which they lost to Troy State in the semifinals. Talk about two schools going in two wildly opposite directions. Hawkins turned around the Bearcats in fairly short order. He went 5-4, 7-2, and 6-2-1 in his first 3 seasons at the helm. In '96, Willamette would finish 9-2 and qualified for the NAIA playoffs, winning their first round game. The next season was even better under Hawkins. The Bearcats went an undefeated 10-0 during the regular season and entered the playoffs as the number 2 seed. They advanced all the way to the championship game where they would lose to Findlay of Ohio 14-7. This remains the school's only appearance in any football championship game. The school also made headlines during the 1997 season when kicker Liz Heston became the first woman to ever score in a college football game. Some will say this was simply a gimmick. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. As the story goes, Willamette was on the lookout for a kicker, and Hawkins contacted the men's soccer team, who was actually playing games and couldn't lose any of their players to the football team. Without a lot of alternatives available, Hawkins' next call was to the women's soccer team, where Heston was put forth for the opportunity. For the record, it's not like the school had this huge student body where they could just do an open tryout. Like, if someone could kick a ball, they were probably already playing on one of the athletic teams. So take from that what you will. This would also be a season of transition for the school's athletic department. They were dropping down from NAIA Division II to NCAA Division III alongside the other members of the Northwest Conference. For Hawkins, the time was right to move on, and thankfully right down the road in Eugene, Oregon, there was a peer of his in need of an offensive coordinator. Oregon Ducks OC Dirk Cutter, who was working under one of those former Davis coaches in Mike Bellotti, was hired by Boise State to become their next head coach, and he tapped Hawkins to serve as the school's offensive coordinator. The Broncos had a really good offense under the combination of Cutter and Hawkins, although I'm not really sure what the latter contributed to this, knowing what we know about Cutter and how he's built and developed offenses over the years. As for Boise State, though, they actually finished 2000 scoring the most points in the country at the D1 level. When the former left for Arizona State, Boise State opted to stay in-house for their next head coach and promoted Hawkins to lead the program. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. Hawkins' approach was tailor-made for the plucky underdogs that Boise State were in the early 2000s. He also made a hell of a first hire for his coaching staff by grabbing Chris Peterson to serve as OC. Make no mistake, those Broncos sides under Hawkins were not the most talented groups around, but he won and won a lot. That 5-year stretch in Boise saw him go 53-11, earn 4 straight WAC crowns, and win 31 consecutive conference games. Let's talk about his approach, Hawk love, whatever you want to call it. Hawkins was always this super positive dude. He was all about uplifting his teams. He really wanted things to be fun, educational, and challenging. He was part football coach, part motivational speaker, part teacher, part friend. He preached things like quality of life balance and trying new things. It's an approach that works when you have a lot of players who may have been overlooked or need someone to believe in them. And it's also an approach best suited for low-intensity markets. There was no pressure at Willamette. There was no pressure in Boise during this time. Fans were simply enjoying the ride that was D1 football. While Hawkins had his fair share of fans in Boise, there were also detractors out there who just thought the dude was full of shit. That, by the way, is a direct quote I have had told to me by multiple Boise State fans who had interactions with Hawkins while he was the school's head coach. They also point to the fact that Peterson not only carried on what Hawkins did on the blue turf, but surpassed it greatly. If Hawkins had stuck around Boise, many of them believe they wouldn't have reached the heights they would go on to reach. Speaking of Hawkins leaving, he did part ways with Boise State at the end of the 2005 season when the Colorado Buffaloes came calling. The school was in desperate need of some good vibes after Gary Barnett had dragged a dark cloud over the program. The belief was that Hawkins was in many ways the anti-Barnett. a culture builder who could tear down the walls that Barnett had placed up around the football program, someone who would make football in Boulder fun. Again, it all sounded great in theory. The reality was Hawkins had never played for or coached a big-time college football school. He went from College of the Siskiyous to Sonoma State to Willamette to Boise State. We are talking millions of miles away from the Big XII. Throughout his time in Boulder, as it relates to the football team, there was just this huge culture clash. Hawkins wanted to operate his football program like some mom and pop shop. When you're in the highest levels of college football, though, you need to think with a more corporate structure mindset. The approach simply just didn't mesh with what college football was becoming in the mid-2000s. There's perhaps no better example of this disconnect than Cody Hawkins, Dan's son. Senior had originally recruited Cody to come to Boise State, but when he leaves for his new job, all of a sudden, Colorado is interested in him. Everything surrounding Cody Hawkins's recruiting and eventual commitment to Colorado, by the way, makes very little sense here. Like, going back and looking through this, what was happening? Dude was somehow an Elite 11 QB rubbing shoulders with the likes of Tim Tebow, Matthew Stafford, Jake Locker, and Josh Freeman. Every other passer in that Elite 11 class had multiple offers to major conference schools. Cody had none of that. It was fairly clear he just didn't belong in this group. Anyway, Oregon, coached by Dan Hawkins' friend Mike Bellotti, offered Cody first. Then Pops offered him at Boise State, goes to Colorado, and offered him again. Somewhat incredulously, later on in his tenure at Colorado, Dan Hawkins tried to make it seem like he wasn't actively recruiting Cody to come to either one of his schools.
And I'm looking around the country, and I got a lot of these quarterback gurus kind of going, Hawk, why you keep looking? Why don't you walk down the hallway and knock on your kid's door and beg him to come to school there?
Come on, Cody Hawkins had 3 scholarship offers in total. 3, that's it. One was from Dan Hawkins' buddy Mike Bellotti, and the 2 others were from schools his dad was associated with in Boise State and Colorado. Trying to claim he wasn't actively pursuing Cody, it's disingenuous. No major conference program wanted Cody Hawkins, and the assumption was always that he was going to play for his dad. On the field, well, the 2006 season was just a washout, and then ahead of the 2007 season, well, Hawkins goes on his legendary "This Ain't Intramurals" rant.
It's Division I football! It's the Big XII! It ain't intramurals!
This is the byproduct of a man being under professional pressure for the first time in his entire career. Everything up until this point for Hawkins had been daisy and crumpets. He'd never really faced any adversity in his career before that. Partway through the 2006 season, Hawkins actually admitted to sleeping in his office for the first time in his professional career. He didn't know how to fix things. Both that and the rant really flew in the face of the quality of life balance that Hawkins had preached throughout his career. Things would get worse when 3 CU players were arrested for fighting with other students and each other in the summer of 2007. Later on, Dan Hawkins wanted to stress the fact that he was going to have no say in the decision over who the starting quarterback was. That was going to be made by offensive coordinator Mark Hilfrich. However, there wasn't really anyone else to play under center apart from his son Cody. It was basically trying to not make the entire saga look like a rampant bout of nepotism. The season wasn't terrible. The Buffs went 6-6 and lost to Alabama in the Independence Bowl. During the offseason, things go from sort of okay to bad. 8 players have ran afoul of the law by June 2008. The message Hawkins continues to preach just aren't connecting with his players. Somehow, someway, a self-proclaimed success coach, Scott Sharp Armstrong, weaseled his way into the Colorado football program. In an article for 5280 magazine or 5280 magazine or however they call it, author Robert Andrew Powell recalls a team meeting where Armstrong stood in front of the team and lectured them about the power of smiling and how smiling more would attract far more success to their lives. The team hated this crap. It just didn't play in a big-time college football environment. And that kind of stuff has never, ever in the history of the world played in a room full of college-aged males. In case you were wondering, Scott Sharp Armstrong, not a real success coach. It turns out he was just a dude who purchased a bunch of Zig Ziglar and Tony Robbins courses and decided to copy their grift. I digress. 2008 and 2009 are wasted seasons for Colorado in which the team switches back and forth between Cody Hawkins and Tyler Hansen at quarterback, neither of whom should have been starting at a Big 12 school. Dan Hawkins had 4 seasons to find a high-level starting quarterback at Colorado, and yet all roads continue to lead back to Cody because no real recruit wanted to be in a QB battle with the coach's son. Worse yet, ahead of the 2009 campaign, Hawkins made his infamous 10 wins, no excuses comment that was plastered just about everywhere. At the Big 12 Media Day ahead of the 2009 season, he went on to try to blame the comment on the internet.
I never guaranteed, I never promised, I never threatened, everybody loves the internet. Bullfrog talked to Firefly and Firefly told Superman.
The problem with that statement is the internet never said it was going to win 10 games, no excuses. Dan Hawkins made that statement. Now, at Big 12 Media Day, before the season has even began, Hawkins was making excuses. Regardless, Colorado wins 3 games in 2009. So how the hell did Hawkins get another bite of this apple? 3 wins is not even close to the 10 wins he promised, and things didn't exactly look as if they were turning around anytime soon. While victories may have been hard to come by, a lot of people at Colorado liked Hawkins' vibes. He was accessible, he was pro-education. Even with some of the off-field issues the program dealt with while Hawkins was in charge, the general consensus was the program was improving in everywhere outside of the scoreboard, outside of the standings. Simply put, a lot of people wanted him to seed because of that. Those wishes, though, would never be fulfilled. Instead, we get the moment that will forever define his legacy as a college football head coach. It's also a moment we probably don't place in the correct context. Colorado had a 28-point lead over the 2-6 Kansas Jayhawks in the 4th quarter of a November matchup in Lawrence. Somehow, Turner Gill's not very good team would score 35 straight points to win the game. It was the biggest collapse in Colorado football history. It was one of the biggest choke jobs the sport had ever seen. The narrative around the defeat has always been Dan continued to call passing plays to help pad Cody's stats so he could break school passing records. But when you go back and you look at that 4th quarter, it doesn't really hold up. Let's just go over this, shall we? Kansas scores to make it 45-24, and then they opt for an onside kick. They would convert it despite the fact it looked pretty clear the Buffaloes had recovered it, by the way. Kansas goes on to score after recovering the onside kick, meaning the Colorado offense doesn't touch the ball until the lead has been slashed to 14 points. The next drive goes run, incomplete pass, complete pass for a first down, run, but the running back fumbles and Kansas returns it for a touchdown. The lead is down to 7 and Colorado's only had 1 incomplete pass here. So the Buffaloes do get the ball back and the series plays out. Pass, interception. I don't think you can fault passing in this situation with a 7-point lead. Additionally, the run game had just fumbled the ball away. Maybe you're thinking, hey, we've had some success passing early on. Let's just keep that up. Then again, having a quarterback better than Cody Hawkins would have helped in this situation. Anyway, Kansas with the interception goes down the score. It's a tie game. Buffs get the ball back, go run, incomplete pass, sack, punt. Jayhawks score again, eventually win the game. This game had nothing to do with nepotism or padding Cody Hawkins' stats, play calling, not running out the clock. This loss had everything to do with a football team just being extremely poorly coached and unable to execute the basics. 2 turnovers on your own side of the field, allowing an onside kick to be recovered, a sack in a crucial drive. This was a failure of epic proportions, but the narrative has just focused so much on Dan Hawkins and Cody Hawkins that I don't think we see the big picture here. The loss was due to widespread bad coaching, not having a team prepared to close out what should have been an easy victory. Dan Hawkins was at fault, but not because of his son. Really though, I guess the players just weren't smiling enough on the sidelines. The loss would be the end of Dan Hawkins' time in Boulder, and I think the baggage from this job, it was just really hard for him to shake moving forward. He wanted to keep coaching, and this led him to scrape the bottom of the barrel for D1 coaching jobs. He applied for the Texas State gig in 2011, but was turned down. UTEP said thanks but no thanks in 2012. In the meantime, he was hired as a color commentator for ESPN's college football coverage, and then seemingly out of the blue, or sacre blue if you will, he was hired by the Montreal Alouettes to be their head coach. This partnership was a disaster, lasting 5 games. Hawkins went 2-3, but Hawklove was reportedly rubbing players the wrong way. His offense wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders either. Sensing a player mutiny and potential franchise implosion on their hands, Montreal's front office opted to cut bait on Hawkins. The coach would continue on at ESPN while spending some time coaching the U.S. national football team and taking a few jobs in Europe as well. In late 2016, Hawkins gets a phone call from home. UC Davis found itself struggling at the FCS level. It had transitioned from D2 up to FCS, but it never really found the success it had at the lower level of the sport. Ron Gould was a poor fit, and the school wanted someone who really knew Davis, a leader who was part of that coaching cradle in the 1970s and 80s, as well as someone who understood the quirks that came along with the university. The Aggies weren't so much concerned with Hawkins' baggage because they were far away from the media spotlight. It wasn't like it was going to come back to bite them. More importantly, though, they saw Hawkins as a hire who could help energize a fan base that was rather listless at this point in time. Bringing aboard the former fullback as head coach was a win-win for both parties. His 6th season, 7 if you want to include the pandemic one, were solid. Yet I've always got the feeling people in Davis were expecting a little bit more, rightly or wrongly. There were also more than a few eyes rolled when Cody was promoted to offensive coordinator in 2021. Look, he was more than deserving of that gig, yet I just think some people were like, really? Are we really doing this here? Anyway, 2018 was his best year in Davis when a team that was predicted to finish middle of the pack in the Big Sky vastly overachieved. They would win a share of the Big Sky title, received a first-round bye in the FCS playoffs, and won a game before bowing out in the quarterfinals. Unfortunately, he never really came close to duplicating this success. There was a playoff appearance in 2021. The school came close to receiving an at-large bid, but were left out of the FCS playoff fields a few other seasons. Like I said, things were solid, but not spectacular for Hawkins. When the Aggies had talent and were predicted to do well, they tended to underperform. Those sides that may have not been the best tended to do better than expected. It is Hawkins' coaching career in a microcosm. Notably, Hawkins really starts leaning into his non-football interest while coaching Davis. In fact, there were times when it seemed like Hawkins wanted to talk about anything other than football. That was one of the things that led to his departure in 2023. He stated he wanted to pursue other interests when stepping down. Well, that and to be closer to family, lol. After a few months of serving as an advisor for UC Davis, Dan Hawkins found a new job, and it was a full circle moment of sorts.
Well, I don't think you can ever say no, because, yeah, how can you? You can't say you can't.
Cody, who was head coach at Idaho State, hired his dad to serve as director of player and staff development. You can take the Hawkinses out of Colorado, but you can't take the nepotism out of the Hawkins. Is that a saying? Should it be a saying? I feel like it should be a saying. I mean, look, it's Pocatello. It's an ideal place for the power of positivity. Hawk loved that approach. Dan doesn't have to do all of the things that come along with being a college football head coach in 2024. He can just help on the feels, the vibes, all of that stuff. Of course, he's also qualified for this role. Yet something that must be noted, Dan's greatest successes as a college football coach came when Cody wasn't in the picture. Willamette in Boise took place when Cody was a kid. As soon as the junior Hawkins hit college age, Dan's career kind of took a nosedive. And if you don't want to use the term nosedive, that's fine, but it never reached the heights that Dan Hawkins reached pre-Cody Hawkins. This is not a total coincidence. All that said, Idaho State has not reached the FCS playoffs since 1981. The Bengals only have had 7 winning seasons since then. If the Hawkins family can bring some joy and some wins to that long-suffering fan base, more power to them. And quite frankly, Idaho State just might be one of the few schools remaining in America where Hawk love could work. Ultimately, Dan Hawkins is misunderstood, and I think some of that is his own doing. He's never wanted you to figure him out.
Stop trying to figure me out.
I just didn't.
That goes all the way back to Jim Sokor at Davis, who was always challenging players in unique ways, trying to get them to think differently. Hawkins made a lot of mistakes along the ways, and he would be the first to admit that. The fit in Boulder was all wrong. He was the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. He also had a panache for annoying people. His shtick was not for everyone. If you needed a person to believe in you, if you needed a pick-me-up, Hawkins was your guy. If you wanted something more, a professional, a boss if you will, you were out of luck. His focus wasn't only on making you a better football player, but a better person. His methods though, well, it made him seem weird or eccentric. Sometimes the things he did, straight cringeworthy. The approach did not translate to the highest levels of college football or a pro football setting. College kids, adult professional athletes, they simply are not interested in unleashing the power of the smile. Hawkins may not have made much of an impact on college football in terms of X's and O's, yet I do think the sport would be a much better place if more head coaches adopted his approach in terms of quality balance of life and expanding one's horizons. You can be passionate about football, you can love football, but you can't let it consume you. The world is a much bigger place than what happens on that 100-yard field. If you focus only on the bubble that is college football, if you only focus on that little speck, you miss out on a lot of great stuff. Dan Hawkins was the son of a logger from nowhere, California. He got to live out his dream. He was a football player and a football coach. He had a family he loves. He had experiences and adventures that most people could only dream of. There were lots of bumps in the road, but you can't help but admire Hawkins in a weird way. He lived life by his own rules. I do not fully understand, I don't even slightly understand some of the things Dan Hawkins did during his college football coaching career. But the thing is, it's not for me or you or for anyone else to understand. Dan Hawkins knew what he was doing. A winner, a loser, a friend, an enemy, beloved, loathed, an intellectual making a living coaching a child's game. A worldly fellow from a town no one has ever heard from. Dan Hawkins' career makes no sense, yet it makes perfect sense. College football's biggest coaching enigma. If there is one thing you take away from this story, it's that if someone is calling themselves a success coach, run in the other direction because they are full of crap. Thank you for watching this video. If you would like to know more about the story of Jerry Glanville and his wild ride as a football coach, well, check out the video on your screen right now. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback. And as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.